Darkness was falling. As John reached for the next handhold, his fingers found perches on the cracked rock face, and he pulled himself upward into the fading sunlight. Another few meters, and he'd reach the ridge before nightfall. A vibration traveled up the line, attached to his harness. Strange. There was no one else on the route. John glanced down to see the cable snaking away into the gloom below. Something was wrong with the anchor. His heart leapt into his throat as the line shuddered again. Harder this time. With a shriek of tortured metal, the steel ring securing the cable tore free from the rock. John had a split second to register what was happening before he was airborne. Then he was falling. The earth rushed up at dizzying speed as he tumbled end over end, grasping at nothing. A sharp, snapshot agony through his leg as it bent unnaturally against the cliff. The pain blew out his senses in a white burst. When John clawed back to awareness, night had already swallowed the forest. His leg was on fire, and a dull throb pounded in his skull. Rolling onto his back, he stared up at a sky full of stars, wondering which one he'd nearly become. As his head cleared, John took in his situation with growing dismay. He was at the bottom of a steep ravine far below the route he'd hoped to complete before sundown. In the dark, it was useless to assess his injuries, but he doubted he'd be walking anywhere tonight. A shudder passed through his battered body that had nothing to do with the chill creeping into his bones. John was alone, helpless, and completely lost in hundreds of square kilometers of unforgiving wilderness. Even if by some miracle, someone found his abandoned gear and deduced his fall, rescue wouldn't come before dawn at the earliest. The forest had become a vast, indifferent void. Every hoot and rustle that drifted through the dense undergrowth set his pulse racing. John tried moving his leg and cried out against the white-hot blaze. Through his agony, the night pressed in, reminding him of how small and fragile he'd become. Somewhere above, unseen among the tangled branches, something clicked softly in reply. The wind whispered through the treetops as darkness deepened over the forest. John lay shivering, listening to unfamiliar noises gathering in the thickets. He strained to pierce the gloom, dreading what predators might stalk the fringes of his feeble firelight. His leg had swollen into a misshapen mass beneath the splint of climbing webbing. Touching it sent fresh flares of torment through his body. John knew he needed medical help, but out here, he could only endure the pain and pray for morning. A harried possum crashed through the underbrush, and John nearly leapt out of his skin. His pulse hammered as fear and fever gripped him in relentless waves. Each flicker of movement drew his frazzled mind into imaginings of stealthy forms, crouched at the tree line, watching with baleful eyes. Trying to calm his rattled nerves, John focused on regulating his hitching breaths. He recited climbing routes, remembered sunny days on the heights, anything to anchor himself against the spreading panic. His effort steadied him slightly, until a sound drifted through the forest that raised the hairs on his neck. At first, he dismissed it as the breeze channeling between the ancient trunks, but it persisted. A low, mournful moan that wound through the night like a bereaved soul lost in purgatory. John strained his pulse, thundering ears, begging silently for any normal explanation. An injured wildcat maybe, or the lonely call of an owl. But the unearthly keening resonated with intrinsic wrongness. It spoke of ancient, inhuman suffering, as if some nameless vestige of primordial darkness had awoken in the forest's lightless depths. paralyzed with fright. John could only clutch his head and whimper softly as the pitiable chorus stretched on, mingling with his delirious imaginings. Ghostly shapes seemed to coalesce at the fire's edge, peering in with hollow, pitiless eyes. At last, the eerie serenade faded like a nightmare retreating before dawn. John slumped back, drained and disoriented. Had it been real, or just another torment, spawned by his feverish mind? Either way, the forlorn cries had pried open doors in his psyche, better left shut. He shivered afresh, as much from within as without. The darkness was complete now, all but the feeble firelight blotted out. Strange sensations crept over John's skin, as if unseen tendrils were exploring his ravaged mind. He scrambled for purchase on his eroding sanity, terrified of being unmade in the night. Somewhere, in the black void between the trees, shadows whispered and the forest held its breath. The hours dragged on as John floated in and out of fitful sleep. His dreams bled into the surrounding darkness until he lost all sense of reality's boundary. Through the fevered dreams, a pervasive feeling of being watched seeped into his bones. When he pried open gummy eyes again, the fire had died to faintly glowing coals. John strained into the inky void, pulse tingling with unnameable dread. Tendrils of mist ghosted between the trees, as if the forest itself had risen to enshroud him. A whisper stirred the mist, barely audible over the thudding in John's ears. He blinked sweat from his eyes, willing the sound to be nothing but a figment. But there, a flicker of movement at the edge of the coal's reach. John froze, breath solidifying in his chest. Two blue orbs peered from the writhing mist, flashing with unnatural luminance. They bore into his soul with alien curiosity, probing the fractured walls of his psyche. Paralyzed, John could only whimper as the glowing eyes edged nearer on wisps of fog. As they breached the fire's ring, their body took dim shape. Vaguely humanoid but tall and willowy, skulking low to the forest floor. Its pale, hairless skin blended eerily into the mist. Where its mouth should be, only a gaunt slit stretched ear to ear, exposing rows of needled teeth. Those haunting eyes bored into John with malevolent intensity, drinking in his terror. A thin, keening issued from its gaping maw, twisting John's frayed nerves to the breaking point. He opened his mouth to scream, but could only retch bile, legs spasming with the urge to flee. As suddenly as it had manifest, the abomination dissolved back into the roiling mist, but its unearthly cry echoed on, mimicked by twisted voices that swarmed the clearing from every shadowed niche. John clapped hands over his ears and thrashed, begging for oblivion. Through his delirium, mocking laughter and whispered taunts assailed him from the mist. Shrouded trees, phantoms coalesced at the fringes to jeer with fanged smiles, dancing just out of reach. The forest had come alive with a legion of haunting faces, contorting on each trunk and branch. Every patch of mist teemed with their leering specters, closing in around John's unraveling psyche. A keening wail rose to a crescendo that threatened to split his skull. Then, silence fell, as sudden and penetrating as a knife. John lay gasping, the forest holding its breath as dark forces converged through the trees. The breathless forest seemed to lean in, pressing around John in the pool of blackness. He clutched his leg and wheezed, blood roaring in his ears. Had he slipped fully into madness already? A susurration rose in the void, whispering unintelligible fragments that jabbed at the prison of John's skull. He screwed his eyes shut, but the gibbering only intensified. worming into his thoughts like maggots burrowing through rotten flesh. When he dared look again, twin blue lights hovered before his face, pulsing with eldritch magnetism. John flung up an arm as if to shield himself, but it passed right through the apparition hovering over his ravaged form. "You called to me in your weakness. Little mortal," a sibilant voice echoed from the lights. "Such fragile vessels, your kind, so easily burst." John shook his head violently, but the voice simply laughed, echoing from every shadow. Cold tendrils seemed to trace his limbs and probe the fissures opening in his mind. "Your kind fear the night, as you do, yet you know not its true face." It continued, touching intangible claws beneath John's chin to tilt up his gaze. "The forest reveals deeper truths to those with eyes to see." Moaning, John squirmed under its palpable touch, wanting only escape from this strangling prison of dread. But there was no fleeing the thing's invasive presence or the shattering of his psyche's thin walls. "Let me show you a vision, child, of the wonder that lies beyond life's veil," the voice crooned, searing frigid lips against John's brow. "Open your eyes and see." Agony lanced through John's skull as his lids peeled back of their own accord. The forest dissolved into a whirling maelstrom, where twisted shapes cavorted and mated. Their obscene revels stripped away his residual humanity until only a screaming void remained. As suddenly as it began, the harrowing trance broke. John was once more in the clearing, locked in a fetal coil, while gibbering laughter rattled the trees. His mind streamed out his eyes and ears in rivulets of madness. "You have tasted but a morsel, mortal," the voice crooned again, now distant but permeating the night. "The true feast lies deeper, when next we meet in the forest of dreams." Then the clearing fell deathly silent, heavy with the nearness of things best left slumbering. John knew only that oblivion now stood between him and the yawning chasm the entity had praised open within. The dawn light brought no relief, only exposing further John's ravaged state. His leg had warped into a blackened, misshapen mass swollen thrice its size. As the fever raged, his mind saw only scraps of reality between visions of twisted bowers deep in the forest. John knew he must move or perish under the entity's gaze, yet even sitting upright drew nausea. Still, something drove him on, a residual instinct to flee the essence that had claims on his soul. Bracing against a tree, John dragged his shattered frame upright, biting back a scream. The world spun sickeningly before coming into foggy focus. He took an exploratory step, balance precarious on his good leg. Pain shot lightning up his side, but he grit his teeth and staggered on. Progress was agonizingly slow through the dense undergrowth. Each snag and root felt placed to trip him. Each shadow held sinister promise. But John pushed on, driven by raw survival instinct, despite his body threatening to crumble with each jarring footfall. Whipped by fever, his hallucinations intensified. From the corner of streaming eyes, he glimpsed faceless forms materializing between the trunks, skulking in unnatural silence. Their long limbs blended eerily into the foliage as they shadowed him with predatory purposefulness. A root caught John's foot, and he crashed hard, ribs singing with new fractures. As he lay gasping, the stalkers closed in, coalescing from the mist, lifting through the trees. Their jointless limbs rippled snake-like as spectral hands emerged, reaching to caress his flesh. With a strangled cry, John lurched forward in a frenzied crawl, Broken nails tore from his fingers as he scrabbled desperately over rocks and rotten vegetation. Behind him came a susurration, like the passage of some immense worm, gaining with dreadful inevitability. At last, a break appeared ahead, a steep decline sloping away into untracked wilderness. John launched himself over the precipice without hesitation. Rocks and brambles tore his flesh to ribbons as momentum burst his cocoon of fever and flung him into raw lucidity. Below, the forest floor rushed up with horrible speed. At the last instant, his flailing grasp found sapling that slowed the descent, but wrenched his shoulder from its socket. Blackness engulfed John as he slumped mercifully into oblivion. The sun bore down mercilessly through the swaying boughs. John floated in and out of consciousness. The line between dreams and waking blurred. Each time he pried open crusted lids, the forest seemed to regard him closer. The tree line pulling inward, John blinked sweat from his eyes and curled into himself, waiting wordlessly for the end as his fever raged. A snap tore through the stillness, jolting John from stupor. Heavy footfalls crunched through dry undergrowth, circling as if unsure whether to flee or advance. John squeezed shut his eyes, half hoping predator or phantom would deliver release. The footsteps shuffled closer until a gasp rent the air, human, piercing with shock and concern. Strong hands gripped John, eliciting an animal moan as flayed nerves screamed afresh. He was dead weight now, only a vessel for the entity that had prowled his dreams. Voices swirled, as if from the bottom of a deep well. John sensed his body lapsing into blissful narcotic delirium as life bled out through 100 wounds. The entity had tasted him and would not let its prize venture, so close to deliverance, its cold tendrils wrapped tight around his failing heart. But dawn was breaking, and sunlight slanted between the trees in long-angled rays. Its warm touch seemed to scour away clinging vestiges of shadow and dream, burning up the last dregs of nightmare, animating John's failing form. He drifted on a sea of light and voices, reality's borders resurfacing like a beach after the tide. Through oceanic sighs, the forest's essence whispered a final farewell and receded into memory. John broke the water's surface with a ragged gasp. Awareness returned in fits. John lay swaddled in blankets within a cluttered cabin as a kindly, wild-bearded man tended his injuries. "Found you at death's door, boy. The forest isn't always so forgiving." John nodded weakly. Something had stalked his steps those dark hours, primal and revelatory. But dawn had dispelled its remnants, as do understanding and community dissolve primordial fears. Reality alone held no answers, but in each other, in daylight and fellowship, we find strength against powers that dwell in solitude and dark. The forest's secrets remain veiled, as do life's meanings. But for now, in sunlight and humanity, there was peace.